Now I want to go and talk a little bit about the actual positive rules, what we call Furu al-Fiqh, right? What are they and how do they work? So again, a fatwa is a universal rule, okay? But as we know from this discussion of the ontology of ijtihad and the hukm, there's a certain pluralism of what the hukm is. There's a ta'addud, there's ikhtilaf, okay? So how do these rules, these fatwas, become operationalized in society? How can it actually function as a system of law, not just an idea of theology about how God makes laws, etc., right? But how can it actually work as a system of law that's enforced by human beings? Okay? Well, in the first level, in the first instance, fatwas can be operationalized by individual human beings. Matter of fact, in most cases. Okay? Now, the most obvious example is ibadah, but I don't want to get into that because ibadah is never a subject of a judge's jurisdiction, according to al-qarafi, because a judge only has jurisdiction over a dispute having a worldly consequence. So you can't go to a judge and ask the judge to issue a ruling as to whether your prayer is valid or not. The judge can't do that. But what a judge can do is the judge can say, this marriage is valid, this marriage is invalid, this sale is valid, this sale is void, etc., etc., etc. So how can a judge go from a fatwa to a ruling? That's kind of the problem that Qarafi talks about in this book called Al-Ahkam fi Tamyiz al-Fatawa al-Ahkam wa Tasarrufat al-Qadi wal-Imam. But before we get there, at least prima facie, every individual has a right to act in accordance with the fatwa. At least until what happens? I'm going to ask somebody. Pardon, Mohammed?
Affect the society?
Well, I don't want to get in affect the society. Yeah.
Comes up against someone else.
Yeah, until there's a dispute about something, right? So, I gave the example of reclaiming unused land. I'm a Shafi'i, let's say, so I see this lot of land, nobody's using it. I look at the earth, it looks to be really fertile. It's like, okay, I'm going to grow some crops here. So I do it. Okay? That's not a problem. Even though Abu Hanifa says I have to ask the opinion of the Imam, until somebody shows up and says, hey, what are you doing? I own this. Or if the Imam comes and said, hey, what are you doing? You haven't asked my permission. I'm going to arrest you or do something to you, etc. Okay? So in the first instance, fatwas are addressed to individual subjects of the law and give them the ability to act or not act if they want to. So how is this done? We have to understand what it is a rule of law is. So a rule of law is made up of 5 constituent elements. Okay? The first is al-hukm al-taklifi. Right? So we have different kinds of ahkam in Islamic law. We have hukm taklif and we have hukm wada'i. Okay? Taklifi means, what's its position vis-a-vis God? So here there's the 5 rules. It's either haram or obligatory or makruh or mandub or mubah. Okay? But that's not all. It also includes things called asbab, legal causes. Okay? It also includes something called shurut, conditions. Then it also has something called mawani', plural of mana'. Okay? And then finally, there's what's called hijaj. How do you prove it? Because, again, we're talking about universal and particular, right? The rule can only be manifested or actualized or operationalized in the world, right? In a certain factual circumstance. the asbab and the shurut and the mawani' are all what we call the haythiyat, the circumstances in which the rule is being operationalized through the behavior of a particular person. Okay? So these are all empirical considerations, right? So you need a way to prove them if you go to court. So a rule of law consists of these 5 elements. It's not just haram and halal. Okay? Haram and halal is al-hukm al-taklifi. All of this is called al-ahkam al-wad'iyya. Sort of what I would say the positive rules. They don't talk about, how God will treat you, reward you or punish you, etc. Okay? So if I want to reclaim land and claim it for myself as owner, I have to follow the probable legal cause. In this case, it's unused, right? The shurut, I think I have to have hiyaza for 7 years or something, blah, blah, blah. Mawani', that there's no valid claim of ownership, etc. And then I need to have proof of all these things in case, somebody comes along to try to stop me, right? So this is the general rule of law. Now, what's interesting here is, again, from the perspective of fiqh, these are all universals. So when the jurist describes the rule of law, everything he's describing is universal. So the asbab are universal in the sense that these are always the asbab for all cases of reclamation. Likewise, the shurut, these are always the preconditions, right? Likewise, the impediments, these are always the impediments. Like this prevents the rule from having its proper legal effect. And al-hijaj this is how it's always been reproven. Okay? So we're still very much at a universal level, right? It can't, as I said, it can be particularized through the behavior of a particular human being. And if there are no objections, then we don't care. But if there is an objection, then we have a duty to go to a judge. Okay? It doesn't matter if there's a judge appointed by the government, because we can also appoint an arbitrator. If there isn't one, we can appoint an arbitrator. But it doesn't matter. Now, if you're the judge and you're dealing with this case, you're facing a kind of dilemma insofar as there are 3 possible rules that govern this case. Okay? So you've got to somehow particularize a universal to solve this problem. And so that's what al-qarafi talks about. He calls what the judge does, judge, arbitrator, whatever, what he does is he does what's known as an insha. He produces a rule. Now, unlike the fatwa, the hukm of the qadi, hukm al-hakim, hukm al-hakim does some funny things. Okay? First, he says, yarfa al-khilaf. It conclusively resolves the dispute. And when you mean conclusively, that means in this life and the next. Now that seems weird because we know there are 3 different rules. So how is it possible that the judge's ruling decides the case conclusively? Well, according to al-qarafi, it's the very particular nature of the ruling that has this effect. Because in usul al-fiqh we have a rule. Al-khas yuqaddam ala al-'am. The particular is given greater weight over the universal when they conflict. Okay, so he says that the judge's ruling is the equivalent of a particular text coming from the lawgiver. And so what it does, if you just allow me to draw some circles here, So these are the three rules: Shafi'i, Malik, Abu Hanifa, right? So think of each circle as a universal domain, including that covers all the cases that logically fall under their rule. Okay? So let's suppose the judge, in this case, rules using Shafi'i's rule. Okay? So the effect of that ruling is it's as though it's a particularizing dalil that excludes this dot from Malik's set and excludes this dot from Abu Hanifa's set. So it abrogates. The judge's ruling effectively abrogates one case out of the universal domain of the fatwa. It doesn't undermine the fatwa, it remains in operation, but only for all other cases. It only continues in solidity prospectively. But for this one case, it's now removed. Right? That's why I sort of blotted it out. Okay? It's been removed from the range of cases that rule applies to. Okay? And he does that because of part of the things is that his job, the job of the judge, is to particularize universal rules in the context of disputes. That's why you have to have a judge. Now, again, there's this issue. Well, how far can a judge go in particularization? Because remember, we're talking about rules that are universals, so they have some kind of connection and grounding and reason. Like at the very least, we have to believe them to be universal. That's the condition of it being valid ijtihad. The mujtahid has to believe that this is the universal rule. Okay? So then we turn around and say the judge can just like exclude some cases from this universal. Are there any limits to that? Right? Well, yes. Okay? Because a judge can't rule arbitrarily. So a hukm, according to al-qarafi, not everything a judge rules has this effect. The judge has to use a valid rule of law. So what makes something a valid rule of law according to al-qarafi? Well, he doesn't define it so much in a positive sense as to tell us what is not a valid